Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. Thank you for being here. This is episode 9. Before we get into the episode, I just want to give a few little disclaimers and give you a heads up as to what is coming. In today's episode, my sister and I dive into the topic of deconstructing Christianity, deconstructing our religious faith that we had both been a part of. And so, while I think this episode could be extremely helpful for a lot of people, it could also potentially be very triggering if you are somebody that still identifies with Christianity and you're just curious about the episode. Please take a listen, but I just want to give you some trigger warnings. It could be offensive. This is kind of our process of, what we went through, how we deconstructed. And so we do get into talking about things that we did not like about the culture and about the teachings and things like that. So just be prepared. If you still identify with that, it may be a little bit triggering. But if you are somebody that has, been through this process before, or somebody that maybe has a lot of questions and you're maybe starting this process, I think it could be really helpful. I also want to give some disclaimers, though, that we do discuss eating disorders, sexual abuse. There's a little bit of adult language in this episode, so just be aware this is probably not the best episode to listen to around small ears. So just be forewarned. Also, just for clarity's sake, I didn't realize until we were done recording, we talk about in the episode, kind of our background and our parents were divorced and then we switched homes to live with our dad. We say mom a lot throughout the episode, but usually most of the time after we talk about our parents' divorce, when we say mom, we're actually referencing our stepmom and our dad, who we were with the majority of the time. And so that might be confusing, and I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, other than that, I hope you find this episode helpful. This is going to be part 1. I'll do a part 2 later this week. Okay, and last disclaimer, I'm going to go ahead and apologize for the audio during the interview. I'm using a new program that I am not super familiar with yet, and the audio, it just is not great. So I'm still working out the kinks. Bear with me on that. We also did record video with this interview, and ultimately I will have a YouTube channel up and running where I will have all of the podcast episodes. So if you hear me reference that, we do have a video format for this as well, but it is not yet up. So I will be sure to let you guys know if you prefer to watch podcasts on YouTube. That will be coming, but it's not there yet. And as always, if you can, I would love for you to leave the podcast a 5-star review. It really, really helps. This is just a brand new podcast. We're just getting started. And so every review counts. So I would love if you would take a moment to do that. It would mean so much to me. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. This is episode 9. My name is Avery, and this week we're doing a really exciting episode, something I've wanted to talk about for years. And so since this was such an important topic, I brought on an important person, my sister. I call her Allie, but her full name is Alarie, so she could go by either one. So hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. We're going to talk about, deconstructing Christianity, which is a really big topic. And as a disclaimer, I just want to say that anybody who, still maybe resonates with the idea of being a Christian, or you still feel like a Christian, this is not to say that, we're not trying to convince anyone not to be. This is really just to talk about kind of how we got to where we are and having it's like a safe space for people who are maybe curious about, or starting to ask questions and aren't really sure where to go. And so I just want to give that disclaimer. Do you want to say maybe a few sentences about yourself just so they can get to know you really quick?
Yeah, so I am Alarie, or Allie, as Avery will refer to me as. I redefined myself in college, so she will always know me as Allie, but I took on a new identity.
Can't undo
by
old
going
habits.
by my given name from birth, Alarie. Right. But so I am your younger sister, forever the middle child. We have always lived in the same state. I'm in Charleston, so I'm on the coast in South Carolina. And I have a couple kiddos, and what else do you want to know about me?
I mean, yeah,
How
just
deep do you want to go?
well, we're gonna get deep. We're gonna get deep. My younger sister, we have 5 total. We come from a blended family,
Mm-hmm.
so we are the oldest and second oldest. So middle child, originally, and then as we blended the family, we're more like upper middle. but
Yes. Yes.
but yes, and so this topic of deconstructing Christianity, I feel like it's something we've been able to bond over because
Yeah.
we'll get into this, but we didn't really grow up in a religious household, and so it's so interesting
Mm-hmm.
how we both kind of got into it and then got out of it. And
Well, it's interesting too how I feel like it's interesting that we're in the same place now because I feel like I followed you into Christianity in a way because we weren't really, I mean, we grew up in South Carolina.
right in the
So
South, Bible
of course
Belt,
it's just around us all the time, but
yeah,
and it wasn't really like driven in hard by our parents or anything. It was just the
mm-hmm.
culture. And so in a way, like growing up, if you went to church, I was like, oh, well, like I want to go to church like my sister, my big sister. So
Yes,
um
sorry, I led
it's
you into
funny
the
that
lion's den in a sense.
yeah, it's funny that I feel like for a lot of people it's their parents. Like not that obviously it wasn't you that like forced me to
Right.
be a Christian.
Right.
But it was the whole culture. Like and I feel like that speaks to uh the power of religion in a way of like it went beyond like family influence. It was really just such the norm around us growing up
Yeah.
in rural South Carolina that was just kind of the expectation of,
That's so true. Yeah, it was almost
you
like
know.
we were outliers almost in a sense, not being in a household where
Mhm.
our parents were really involved in Christianity or in the church. And so it was almost like, at least for me, I kind of just put myself there.
Yeah, yeah,
So
because that's like, well, that's where people hung out. Like that
yeah,
was
yeah.
youth group was like the place to be. Like,
That's so true. It's so true. At least for
yeah,
us. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So all right, well, we'll get into that. But yeah, okay, well, let's kind of, yeah, define that because we had an, kind of a little bit of a messy, chaotic upbringing. But we
Hmm.
live with our parents are divorced. We live with our mom up until I was in 6th grade. I was 12. That would have made
Third grade.
you, yeah.
Yeah.
And so she was not religious at all whatsoever. Came from
Our
a,
biological mom.
yes, like that was just not something that we really ever talked about. It just wasn't the norm. That was all we knew. And then our dad got full custody and we moved in with our dad and our stepmom. And they also were not very religious. I would say they were just kind of
Hmm.
um, like almost like nominal. I don't know what the proper word would be, but just kind of like, yeah, we go to church on Christmas and Easter and we believe in God, but we're not like, we're not trying to push anything on you.
Yeah,
Were you going to
yeah.
say
They were
something?
never. Yeah, I feel like they took us to church because that's again like just what everybody did around us, and it was community. They had a lot of friends there. Like, why wouldn't they take us to church? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was just so the
It
norm.
was true.
Like
It
it's
was more
just
of a
so embedded
community
in the
thing for
culture.
them, probably. Like they're
Yeah,
very social, and so
yeah.
it was almost like, yeah,
Hmm.
let's go, let's go to church and see our friends.
Yeah, yeah. But it's
Yeah,
not like we talked about religion at home.
right, exactly. And there were seasons I feel like where we were maybe a little bit more into it. Like I remember being like the acolyte who like walks down the aisle and lights the candles at one point, but it was like that even felt like
Oh
a
wow.
short season. Um
Hmm.
and that wasn't something that lasted very long. So again, it just, and there was, yeah, like we said, we didn't really talk about it at home, so there was no pressure. It would just kind of was.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so it's so interesting because they really did, I feel like, leave it open for us and gave us a lot of freedom to explore. And
Hmm.
so for me, at some point in high school, I don't know at what point, maybe like my sophomore or junior year of high school, like you said, I had friends that were very much in the church and were much more just religious, and their faith was very important to them than I was. And so I was like, well, I want to do what you guys were doing. I really wasn't. I had my fair share of wild moments, but I wasn't like really a partier. Not again. I had my moments like every high schooler, but I really wanted to pursue that um, path of Christianity because I was surrounded by it and they seemed like it was working really well for them. And I think internally I was coming to an age where I really felt like I was drawn to this idea of wanting to connect with God, but I didn't know any
Mm-hmm.
other way to do that except for Christianity because that's the only outline that I had. Like that was the only option that I saw externally that gave me like a blueprint for how to connect with God. And so I was like, well, I guess this is what you do. You become a Christian and you go to Christian churches. That's how I connect with God. So it was like, I kind of just became a shoo-in in that sense because that, you know what I mean? It was like the only option. And so yeah, I remember going to youth group. There was a church right next to our neighborhood. And I was friends with a
Mm-hmm.
girl whose dad, I think, was the youth leader there. And so I started going there,
Mm-hmm.
and that was like a super Pentecostal church. And so
Yeah.
that was an
We didn't
interesting
even
going
know.
through.
You, it's so funny looking back. Like when I tell people now, I'm like, yeah, I went to a Pentecostal youth group. And like now that I know what it means to be a Pentecostal church, I'm like, whoa, that was intense. But at the time, it was just the neighborhood church. Like
Right.
we just had no concept of like
No reference.
different types of Christianity, like even like different beliefs or norms within a church. Like that was like
Right.
really our first real introduction to like a church of our own. And it is wild to think that that was our norm.
I
And so
know.
maybe we could talk about, I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but, I mean, we could kind of, I mean, I guess it's going back to the beginning of like what church looked like for us in a Pentecostal youth group.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's so funny
Like,
now looking back. Yeah, because I remember, yes, I mean, there were, and these are like, mind you, high schoolers. And I know
mhm,
nothing about Christianity. Like, I'm really just hearing all of this stuff for the first time. Because even though we would go to church, I didn't really fully understand the concept because we really didn't go to like youth group or anything like for young people with
mhm,
like at home. It was not until this youth group where it was like they were speaking to kids in a way that I could understand like the full
right,
breakdown of
right.
what
Mhm,
what they were teaching. And so I still really didn't have a full concept, and so I would go and there would be people like just during these worship sessions, people were on the floor and they were like moving all around, and some people were like speaking in tongues, and it was just so, and I was like, I guess I guess this is what it looks like. And I just kind of accepted it because I was like, okay, you're just so impressionable
yeah.
at that
Well,
age.
it was intense and it was emotional. And I mean, I think everybody,
Emotional, yeah.
can, I mean, anybody that is going through deconstruction now, I think probably has stories of the emotional aspects of worship. Like I feel like it always goes back,
Yes.
especially in youth groups for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
which we could get into the reasoning behind that. But
Mm-hmm.
for in youth groups for whatever reason, there's a lot of emphasis on the worship and it is. I mean, I think I wept, the first time and then every time after that, and I don't think I was even sure why.
Yeah.
It just that it was intense. It was
Mm-hmm.
just and I was probably at in middle school. You were like in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and I was probably in middle school, and we were just going to the neighborhood church, and our parents were like, well, cool, they're like hanging out in a safe place. They're not
Yeah.
doing drugs, so like, why
Right.
wouldn't we want them to go to church? And they
Right.
seem like they're enjoying it. They want to go. They have friends
Yeah.
there. Uh, Really, they had I don't think they had any
I
idea
don't
what
think they
actually was
did.
happening. They never like came. They didn't go to that
Right.
church.
No, they didn't.
They never went to youth group, which I
Yeah.
guess why would they? I mean,
They
maybe
didn't
parents
know
now
anything
think
about the
differently,
church.
but
Right.
they knew nothing about it. They just thought they're going to go play games and have fun. Little
Yeah.
did they know we were in a dark room weeping on the floor with people speaking in tongues around us. Like,
That's so true.
I mean,
Yes.
if I'm trying to picture Dad, our father, being in that room,
He would have been like, this is nuts, y'all.
he
Oh my gosh. I mean, they're so chill about it, like, which now as a parent, I really like, I love that about them, but I do
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it was extreme. Even for
Mhm,
them, it would have
mhm.
been extreme. And yeah, it is like, it's the music, it's the dark lights, it's the people around you and their energy influencing you. So you just get sucked into this like vortex of
Yeah.
emotion. And like it's like you watch a movie and cry, or you listen to a song and cry. It's like it doesn't take much to really like tap into that emotional side. And so
Mhm.
when you're young, you're in a setting where everybody around you is doing it, and then you have somebody teaching you what they're telling you is absolute truth,
Mhm.
and then they're acting out in this way. It's really hard as a young person who has no concept or no really full understanding of this to not just be like, okay. And I think we were both pretty open-minded to it, and we were like, yeah, okay, like this seems
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
And we trusted the people that we knew there. And yeah, it was so yeah, that was our first introduction to
Mhm.
Christianity. And
Mhm.
I remember what became my like story of being saved was there was a moment where it was really, I was sitting next to my friend who again was the daughter of this youth pastor. And I remember for the first time when he was teaching, it was just that it clicked. Like all of a sudden, I was like, oh, that's how it works. Oh, you're supposed to ask for
Yeah.
forgiveness and ask Jesus into your heart
Yeah.
so you don't go to hell. It was like all of a sudden, even though I had been in and out of church, for years, I never really got it because they
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
usually. Typically, when you go to a church service, they're not like giving you the salvation story in a way that a young person can understand every single service.
Right.
So it really just didn't
Yeah.
click. And so I
Yeah.
remember just it clicking for the first time. And I looked over to my friend Becca and I was like, oh, okay, well, will you help me? Like, what do I do? How do I like say this prayer or do this thing? And I remember her just being like overjoyed and being like, oh yeah, like let me help you. And so she like walks me down the aisle to the front of the room.
The
And
altar calls.
I
Yeah.
know, yeah.
Mhm.
And she
Yeah.
basically says the whole thing for me. And I'm just like, like whatever you say. And she's like, saying this prayer about, me being saved and opening. I remember a phrase about like opening the gates of heaven and all, just typical like
Mhm.
church speak. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I remember in my like student Bible, I wrote like, oh, my new beginning. It was in February too. So ironic. It was
Mhm.
like February. I don't know what that would have been, like 2000 and no clue, 6, 7, something around there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Did you have like a moment where you like accepted?
Well, you know what's funny is I was thinking about this recently because I found a picture of that mom and dad had printed out of one of the times I had gotten baptized because apparently I did it multiple times. Like I kept just thinking I didn't really mean it the first time. And so I think I got baptized probably like 3 or 4 times.
Oh, that's so funny.
I think
Like you're
the
convincing
first
yourself.
time, yeah, no, literally. And it's like, I knew that I had done it before, but I was like, well, I'm more of a Christian now and I believe more now. So this is my real conversion. Like before I
Yeah.
believed the false Christianity and now I really understand
We
what I'm talking about.
indoctrinated the
So
hell out of ourselves.
yes, yes. I mean, I truly like, it's just so funny when you think about it. But yeah, I think that honestly, I think that kind of similar with the baptism, like I think that I never really felt like I was saved. And so I think
Mm.
I did that conversion prayer, uh, like multiple times, like many times, because every time I would get emotional and was like, well, I don't feel like I am clean or saved yet
Mm.
or whatever. And so I would just do it every so often just to kind of make
Yeah.
sure I was good. Cause
Reset.
you know,
Just so
just,
we're clear, God.
just so we're clear, I really mean it this time. Because it's I mean, it's looking back, like as a middle school, I don't know, probably 12, 13 years old. I'm thinking like, I mean, we were like, I mean, I didn't go through a rebellious stage until I was in
Right.
college. So like,
Yeah.
I really like, I just thought, well, my parents aren't, I thought my parents were, I thought our parents were sinners, like just like doomed.
We were
The
like, you guys are going to hell. We're good, but
Truly, truly. I remember getting in fights with mom and dad about, and they like took us to church, but it wasn't, they took us to church, but it wasn't the right church. And it
we
wasn't,
rebuked them for not being like
yes,
religious
yes.
enough.
And now it's just cringy to look back on.
I know. I have the same thoughts.
So uncomfortable.
It's so funny because we're both like pretty like outspoken and we like stand in our beliefs. And so we were we were probably like the two worst teenagers to have for this.
Oh my gosh, like our parents had quite the spectrum of teenagers. They had the worst of both worlds. They had the like super rebellious in the traditional way in the form of our brothers, and then the most like righteous, like I am better than you.
Yes.
Like other end of the spectrum and the girls. And so my parents were just like, we literally can do nothing right. Like
I know. They were hopeless. They didn't stand a chance. Yeah. But I remember the same thing, like getting on to dad about this or that. And dad was so like, I think there's a lot of ways to God. I think, different people, which now I like totally align with. But at the time I was like, no, dad, there's one way. And poor dad, he took it in stride. And he really, I feel like they both did a good job of just being like, okay, we'll hear you out. Like, well, tell us what you believe. And they let us, go down our own paths, for years and into college and young adulthood. And then finally, we've both like kind of come around, but man, it does honestly.
I wanted to go to Liberty University for a while. And mom and dad never, to my face, like fought me on it, which wow. They never like, there were other Christian universities that I looked at going to, in the South, and they like, mom took me to tour them, like all of that. Like she was like, it's your choice. She was very like open to it. And then a few years ago we were talking and she was like, yeah, I remember when you said you wanted to go to Liberty and your dad lost his mind and was like, we're not sending our daughter there. And it's so funny because I had no idea that they even felt that way. And honestly, like to their credit, because I think if I didn't end up going to a Christian university, and I think probably if they had fought it, it would have put a light under my butt to go and be like, well, this is, the devil keeping me, this is a sign that I have to go.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. Yes.
So I'm really thankful for the way that they handled us. Kind of going back to the youth group. I mean, I'm sure your listeners will probably have similar stories to this, but beyond youth group, there was church camp, which once you went to church camp, you don't come back the same person. And that was where I first spoke in tongues. Did you speak in tongues?
No, I never had the guts to attempt that.
I did.
I remember you doing it and me being like, really? What? Like, how does that work?
And to this day, it is a mystery to me.
Do you feel like at the time, do you feel like you earnestly felt like you were almost like translating something, or do you feel like you were like trying to force it?
And honestly, still, I mean, thinking back now in a spiritual sense, I mean, it's kind of interesting, and maybe this is where we can kind of like go deeper in this direction. Like I do feel like as much crap or as much like shit as I talk about, like if I could say the shit, but
go ahead.
Much shit as I could talk about like the church and ways I felt manipulated in different ways, like, and the ways that I feel like even speaking in tongues like is used to influence people. I kind of do feel like still, as like non-religious as I am today, I feel like there was something happening there.
Okay.
And I am in that place now because of my relationship with the spiritual and my belief in spiritual beings and channeling and connecting
It's like
in
you
that
still could
way.
have been channeling something without
What
really
I
having.
connected with,
Yeah.
yes, I cannot tell you what I connected with, but I
Mm.
know that youth in the church, I do think they were speaking something and they were connecting with something in the spiritual. Who knows what it was?
Oh, that's a really great point. Yeah.
And to be honest, I distinctly remember when it happened the first time, and then it happened times after that. But I was at church camp, and these are the kind of camps like I'm sure that other people will resonate with. But you go, the worship is hours long. You're staying up late. You're doing like intense games and like activities and relay races and stuff all day long. So you're physically exhausted. And then you go into these worship sessions and intense speakers at night, and it's hours long. I mean, who knows what time we were going to sleep?
It's almost like in a police interview where they just like push and push and push and put, and you're so tired at the end. These people do like a confession, you know, it's like, it's just a lot of emotions. And
and in the Pentecostal church specifically, there's a lot of emphasis on helping people speaking in tongues because it's a huge belief that it's a way that you're like washed in the spirit. Like it's like the Holy Spirit's supposed to be coming over you and you're speaking your secret prayer language. It's a secret. I remember being told things like, well, when you're speaking in tongues, the devil can't understand what you're saying. So it's a way to pray. Literally, like I remember sitting with like the pastor's wife and being like, well, this is my secret prayer language with God. And so when I pray this way, the devil doesn't know what I'm saying. And so that makes it like a stronger prayer. Even if I didn't know what I was saying.
Wow.
I was saying something.
Oh, that I don't like that. Feels so icky to like, yeah.
I know. And now I'm like if my soul was saying something, connecting with something, channeling something, what was it? Because I remember in that moment, this is embarrassing, but it's honest.
Let's hear it.
On the ground. There was a whole thing. This is so interesting to think about. When a woman or a girl fell on the floor fell on the floor in the spirit. They would say they're in the spirit when you're speaking in tongues. And this is how dramatic it is. If you haven't never been to a service like this before, you fall on the floor, you're like writhing around, and this is just accepted as normal. I mean, you see it so often. And then someone would come and put a blanket over the girl because, you know, your shirt might come up, or if you were wearing a skirt. And so people would have like blankets, they would come and lay over you so you could continue to writhe on the floor and speaking in tongues. So these like 12-year-old girls are rolling around on the floor doing this. I had been laying on the floor speaking my prayer language for a while. And I remember the like lead preacher guy who had just spoken his sermon came over to me and he tapped me on the shoulder to kind of like get me up out of, I don't know if he was like, this girl's been in it for too long. Like I got to get her out. I got to break her out of this thing that she's
so
in.
Wild too that everybody's so young. Like I can't imagine seeing a bunch of 12-year-olds doing that. Even if I believed that, and just knowing how impressionable that age is and being like, this is...
my gosh. Because we have daughters like that age now.
Yeah.
And so to think about that happening and us having no idea that was happening is weird. It's just weird.
Yeah,
it is.
It's red flag.
And yeah, so I'm laying here on the floor. I've got a blanket on me that I don't know. Your eyes are closed typically when you're in the spirit.
Oh my god.
Oh, this is like a deep memory that I'm uncovering.
Repressed memory.
He came up to me and he said, "I just want to know, like, what is the Lord? What are you seeing? What is the Lord, you know, showing you?" And I remember I said, "I see my mom burning in hell." Yeah. And I remember sitting crying during his service, being like, my mom's going to hell and it's my job to save her. And I was just distraught as a little child, crying, and felt the need to go into this secret prayer language with some sort of entity speaking in a language that I don't know, saying what I don't know, but that was what was going through my mind is the picture of my mom burning in hell. And my heart was like, I'm scared of that. So it was a very when you really break it down, and especially now being in a very different place spiritually in my beliefs, it's even scarier than when I just kind of deconstructed in a like sense of like I'm deconstructing from religion. Now I've gone through the process. I've deconstructed from religion, but I've rebuilt a sense of spirituality and accepting like there is something like a spiritual world that people tap into with religion, and religion is a way of like making sense of what that spiritual world is. Now I wonder what we were tapping into, and thankfully like I'm in a good place now, but I think that there is something to that, and the vulnerability of children where they're opening themselves up to a spiritual world.
Yeah.
That we're not really sure what they're connecting with, and without giving them a sense of, without giving them tools for spiritual protection.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Because
Yeah.
it's like the
Yeah.
Wild West, you know, when you're, because a lot of Christians, it's like, you know, they are tapping into the spiritual world that some of them also don't believe in. And so they're like,
Right. They
we don't
believe.
believe. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They're very picky and choosy about, well, we don't, you know, we don't believe in all this like spiritual stuff, but also there's demons. And so I'm like, okay, so, you know, but if you talk to
And
them
there's
about
no
like,
in between. There's no in between. There's just God and demons.
And demons.
And yeah.
And maybe angels, but they don't really come into play unless it's a miracle.
And angels aren't women. So
right. God forbid.
Right.
So, okay. So this is really interesting because I want to kind of go into like what, you know, where we kind of went from there. So like we clearly had this like very abrupt start with like Pentecostal and like this was our introduction. And then I want you to talk about where you went to after that, because for me, it was like, I kind of got out of the Pentecostal bit. And then I like literally found a church just nearby us. It was in the Charlotte area. It was like 20-30 minutes from us at the time. And I would just go by myself. And I think there was one, like a friend of mine who also happened to go to, there's a couple friends of mine from high school that would go with their families. And so I would go occasionally with my friend. And then I just started going by myself, and I wouldn't really get plugged in. I didn't know anybody. I just literally went and sat and worshiped and listened. And then I would go home. And that was just my way of feeling like.
Do I know that is this a big church? Or are you going to say the name of it?
No, it's not that one. Are you going to say New Spring?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was going to say Elevation.
No, I did go to that one occasionally, but that was more in college. I may have gone there in high school, but no, it was like, I think it was like a Presbyterian church, but it just was because I had a couple friends whose families went there. And, but it, you know, it was much more calmed down, and, I would just go and come home. And that was just my way of feeling like, I just really felt like, again, I wanted to connect with God, and I had this like yearning in me that like, I know there's something on the other side. I want to connect. I want to pray. I want to tap into this spiritual side, but that was the only avenue that I knew of. And I, you know, I just kind of took it for what it was without really questioning it at the time. And then from there, I went to college, and in college, a lot of my friends and roommates were, again, they came from much more religious families, religious backgrounds. They were much more well-versed in, you know, the theology and the whole package. And so in college, I started going to New Spring, which a lot of listeners may know, the big church, especially in the South. I don't know how far out they go. I know they're really big in South Carolina.
I feel like they've
did they change? I know that the pastor left and he started a new church, but I don't know if old New Spring. Anyway, really big in South Carolina. And so yeah, it was a mega church, the big spectacle, the show, it was like really big, and it was much more, I would say, beginner friendly, you know, like it wasn't, they didn't go really deep into like, you know, they didn't go deep into the biblical theology. Yes, it wasn't so much of that. It was much more, yes, like I would say open-minded and welcoming.
Salvation. It was very much based on
salvation and values. Yes, that's true. That's true. So I started going there in college. That's where I got baptized, was at New Spring Church in college. And that's where I was going to church every Sunday. I was really hardcore. I was going to FCA at Clemson. I was involved in all these church groups. All of my friends were Christians. It was very much like a full community package, that's when I really started like studying the Bible and really like deep diving into things and really learning the ins and outs of, you know, these biblical teachings, at least from my point of view, or how I was being taught them and understanding them. And then I met my now husband, who came from and I want to be clear, I'm going to mention him because he's part of my, story, but my views in no way, shape, or form reflect his views, and he has his own personal views. And it's not, I wouldn't use the word deconstruction for him. He's kind of on his own path, and I don't even want to define it, but mine are separate from his, but we are very much aware of that, and that's fine. So anyway, but he came from a much more religious background. And so with him, when we started dating, that kind of led me into a much more, I've like lost all the Christian language now because I've been out of it for so long.
Yeah.
I'm like, gosh, I used to know this like the back of my hand. And now I'm like, what's that word that I can't think of?
Yeah.
But he was much more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like theology based. But just much more conservative. And so he, is there a word?
Yeah, he I feel like always has really like he studied English. Like he's very
he took
like
a lot of religious classes. He knows the ins and outs. Yeah.
Yeah. The real like literature of the Bible. Like,
yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to a church with him that was much more conservative, much more very strict theology based. And there is a word that I'm thinking of. It's like Calvinism, like it was like very Baptist, very
like Lutheran and Calvinist.
like Calvinism. Yes, there's like an F word, and I can't think of it. And I'm sure people that have, been deep in Christianity know what I'm talking about. But anyway,
fundamentalist.
Yes.
Fundamentalist?
Very fundamentalist. Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I kind of got on that path and followed him there. And that's when I would say my first doubts started, because now that I was a little bit older, and I had come from New Spring, which was very much more just kind of open-ended. And I felt more comfortable there. It was easier to be a Christian in that setting. And then moving to this very much more strict, fundamentalist setting with him was very like, ooh, this is a lot. Like I still was like dedicated. I was dedicated to him. I was dedicated to this path. But there was definitely, that's when the deep-seated like doubts started to be like, this is kind of a lot. Like this is kind of suppressing. This is kind of like not a whole lot of respect for women, or it was like a very thin path, very narrow path that women were expected to go on that I didn't really always resonate with. And I was like, okay.
And it was all about just surrender to scripture. Just accept,
and obey your husband, and this is your role, and gentle and quiet spirit. And I was like, I am neither gentle nor quiet. This is not a good role for me. And I was like, okay, I was fully dedicated, but I was still, there was definitely, that's when a voice started in the back of my head. But he was like very much on the path of, he wanted to pursue ministry. So we were both in college at the time, and he was offered a job at a church plant. So once we graduated college, we went and joined this church plant, and that began what became a 10-year long, this was, like 12, 13 years ago now. But for 10 years, really, we were in the thick of it, where I would have considered myself like, oh, I'm a pastor's wife. Like it was like the thick of it. And he's still involved with ministry, with in his own way. And that's like totally fine. We're like, we're very much aware of where the other one stands. But that was where I got exposed to all different kinds of Christianity. And so we started out at this church plant, which was, again, it was still very like Baptist and, very strict, very theology based, but it was a church plant. It was more cozy. So it was less like judgmental. It wasn't so structured, I would say. Then from there, we went to a very large church that was very, very Baptist, very, these are the rules. These are the expectations. This is his theology. And everybody was just waiting for somebody to fall out of line to judge them, or to say something, or to
church accountability.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And I'll get into that later, but that was an awful, awful experience for me personally. I hated it. And I would say I have like trauma from that season of my life. And then up until, and we were there up until about 2020, which is when my deconstruction process started. But so that was like really rambly, I feel like. But where did you go after, you know, after your whole like high school, very Pentecostal experience? Where did it go from there?
Yeah. So in high school, it was still mostly like the Pentecostal experience. I started getting introduced to the larger mega churches, like you said, New Spring, Elevation was another one that was really popular in our area. That's when I feel like mega churches were like really taking off with like, you could have the streaming of, you could have a pastor. And so it was just like a really big, exciting idea. And worship again was a huge part of that. And so I feel like I kind of followed that into college. I started to identify more with that. In a way, it was a little bit cooler than like being Pentecostal. Not, and because they're the cool kids, went to the big churches. So I followed that. As I got older, I went through a brief, rebellious period
gotta do it,
in college. And it really, I think it really, it started, start of college is super difficult for, I think, most everyone.
Yeah.
And so that first year I struggled.
And we went to separate colleges. I want to note that.
Yeah.
So like we were not together. You attended Clemson for like a second and then realized it wasn't for you.
And then I transferred.
Yes. So we were not in the same place. So sorry. Didn't mean that. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. We both now, recognize like we have anxiety and have like gotten medication for that and dealt with that. But at the time that was not something that and maybe partly being in the church, it wasn't something that I recognized as something that I could possibly struggle with. I just thought I wasn't praying enough. I wasn't a good enough Christian. I needed to depend more on God. It didn't even cross my mind that I should get medicated. And so I really struggled that first year of college and leaned more on drinking. And I remember at the time thinking, I'm really struggling in these areas of my life, wanting to hook up with boys. And that wasn't allowed, and feeling like anytime I slipped up, like, oh, I went to a party and I drank, I couldn't possibly tell my Christian friends that, even though that's where I had spent most of my life, and I couldn't possibly tell that to them because they were going to judge me and not see me as a Christian anymore. And so I leaned more on my friends that weren't Christian because I was like, they're not going to judge me.
And isn't that so interesting that like the Christian community that touts this whole reputation about being loving and being there for each other and being forgiving and forgiveness.
And that's the whole point. Yeah.
It's so alienating.
Right. Because there's this idea that once you become a Christian, you
can't make mistakes anymore.
You can't make mistakes. You're supposed to act differently than you did before.
Right.
And it's interesting what is and isn't allowed. So within that, but for, I felt more comfortable during that time of life when I was really struggling to lean on my friends who weren't Christians, and, went through my rebellious period, found my way back to church because I really hit rock bottom, like mentally. And I was like, I felt so guilty and yucky and just gross that I was like, well, now I identify as a sinner. So now I can go back to church and say, I left God and now I can come back. And it felt more like I was going to be embraced with open arms because I was someone coming back to church.
That's so interesting.
I was the lost sheep, I could deal with being that, but I couldn't deal with being a Christian that messed up. Like it was easier for me to identify with, to be welcomed back into the church. I knew that if I had immediately turned back to my Christian friends right after I messed up, I would feel like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble. But if I stayed away long enough and messed up enough, then they would be nice to me because
so isn't it funny?
I would then be a sinner,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Psychology games.
So, yeah. And it becomes so much about the community and you're thinking about what your community thinks about you. And it really becomes about the people in the church and not about God, you know? It's all, you know, it's all relationships with people. But anyway, I kind of went through that, came back into the big church kind of thing. And again, was still in that, like you said, New Spring, and churches like it in that mega church kind of format. They're more focused on evangelism and getting people in the church and growing the church numbers rather than deepening people's, rather than deepening people's understanding of scripture. It was very surface level. And they kind of knew that, and they talked about it, and they would say like, oh, well, you really deep dive in the small groups. But
yeah, that's true.
I found that I really enjoyed studying scripture and studying religion and kind of like understanding the time period and, you know, really learning the scripture. Like I found that I, just for my personality, really liked that like deep, intense study of it. And so as I got older and like in my later years in college, and then even after I graduated college, a lot of my church experience was in a really like theological, like deep understanding of scripture. Like I really wanted, I really wanted to understand and know. And I really, like, I was leading a small group and I loved it. In fact, that I looked into going to seminary. Like I wanted, that was my whole thing.
You were all in.
I was really all in. And I even still enjoy studying scripture and religious texts. I find it interesting from like, I know
we'll have to do a part. We'll have to do a part 2 on like how you read the Bible now and like that whole, because I know that's its own deep dive on its own.
It's a completely different way that I read the Bible. But yeah, I was going to go to seminary, and now the turning point for me, it's funny and it's a vulnerable place to share, but partly because it's not my story to share exactly, but in college, I went to the College of Charleston. It's a more liberal place. And I had a lot of friends that were part of the LGBTQ plus community. And in really deep diving the scripture and really wanting to understand and like really be a good like follower of Christ, follower of God, I always kind of felt like God probably doesn't care, you know, about gay people being in relationship. Like it's about love and it's about relationships. Like I kind of like baseline was always like, yeah, I think it's fine. But then as I like really wanted to deep dive and understand, and I talked to people in the church to understand that, they pointed me to resources which were like, oh, God can change that in you, and God can, you know, here are some resources to understand that, because these were some of my closest and dearest friends. And if this was truly what God was calling, you know, was saying that this is right and this is wrong and people should be with a man and a woman and that's it. I wanted to surrender to that truth. And I did. I surrendered to that. And even though I thought like, in my heart of hearts, I thought this seems like harmless. It seems fine. But if this is what scripture says, I guess I have to surrender to it. And if I love my friends, then I have to, you know, steer them towards God and steer them towards truth. And, once I started trying to have those conversations with my friends, it felt so wrong in my heart. Like once I started actually confronting, taking this scripture of saying, okay, God doesn't want you to do this, and actually taking that to people that I loved and cared about. And I knew their relationships and saw how loving it was, and having to say that because I thought that's what God wanted. Me saying it is what made me be like,
this
that
feels
didn't
wrong.
feel right.
Which is
that
so
didn't
interesting.
Feel right.
And honestly,
roll it back.
Kudos to you, because that, as like, for people who are like, who do identify currently as Christians, very few people have the guts to actually like put their, money where their mouth is, like put and
Mhm.
actually go through with these things that they say they believe or confront people, which is what the church preaches and what you're told to
Mhm.
do. But very few people actually go through with that. And so you
It's a
were
lot
quite
easier.
literally, yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
were
mean, it's a lot easier
doing
to
it.
just not have those relationships
Yeah.
and to say like, oh, on the internet or just generally like, this is my belief before you get deep down into a relationship with someone. Yeah, I was deep. I mean, my best friends, and to go to my best friend who I loved for years and be like, this is not what I think is for you. Like, and I felt how wrong that felt to say. And I saw the pain that I had caused in saying that. And I it just didn't feel right in my spirit. Yeah, it
Mm,
just, the action of me submitting to that truth, quote, truth that I believed at the time, I, I realized that
was
I
like a
didn't
wake
believe
up
it.
call of sorts.
It was a
Yeah.
wake up call. And it took me a few years to come back to that friend and say like, that was wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
And you guys are
sorry.
still friends today,
We're still
right?
friends. We're
Which is
still
awesome.
to their credit, because I wouldn't shame anyone for dropping someone after hurting them
Right.
like that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, my own pride kept me from going back and being like, immediately and saying like, oh, that didn't feel right. I'm sorry.
Mm.
I kind of, it took me a few years to go back and apologize, but I did. And that was my first, like, I really am trying to submit to this. And I just don't think this
Yeah.
makes sense. That was kind of my first red
We're
flag,
first.
if you
Yeah.
will, in terms of like, I feel like it just didn't align in my spirit. Like,
Yeah.
to use church language.
And that's all it takes is like, I
Yeah.
feel like for a lot of people, you have several camps. I feel like some people they feel unsettled, but they kind of just ignore it or they push it down and go, no, these are the rules, or they blame it. Oh, that's Satan trying to create doubt in my mind. It's the enemy, and so they shove these feelings and these thoughts down and ignore it. Or I think you have people that they're curious and they have those feelings for whatever reason of like, okay, this isn't sitting right, or this doesn't align with me. This is just doesn't feel good in my body. I should pay attention to that, but they don't have enough either information or they just feel scared. I think for a lot of people, their whole foundation, I think for us, it was like because we had a life before Christianity, that allowed us to have some sense of like, okay, we know this isn't everything. If we leave, I think there was a little bit of safety knowing that our family wasn't super religious, that we weren't going
Mhm.
to be disowned
Mhm.
by our parents. We
Right.
had we
Right.
had a soft spot to land. Like it would have been difficult with our friends and our community that we had built around us, but we still knew that there was life outside of this. I think for a lot of people, they don't have that. They've built literally their entire foundation on these quote unquote truths that they don't know how to have a life outside of that. They don't know what that looks like. They
Mhm.
can't imagine it, or
Mhm.
they don't have family or friends or anybody to talk to about it. And so it's
It's
just
often
more,
harder to
yeah,
not
exactly.
believe that.
It is.
It is
It's
a harder
scary.
choice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I've seen that with a lot of people, whether or not they are questioning things. I think, gosh, this person, maybe people I've had hard conversations with, I'm like, they don't have anywhere to go. There is no alternative. So
Mhm.
I completely understand why they wouldn't even want to question, because it's
Mhm.
too scary. Maybe it would ruin their marriage, or maybe it would just, their parents would disown them, or whatever it is. Or maybe they just have really close friends, like, who would disown them, and that feels really scary. So I totally understand where people are coming from, but I do think there and I think that's why I wanted to have this conversation in the first place, was just to say it seems really scary, and some of those things might happen. Like I definitely lost friends whenever
Oh yeah.
I decided, to deconstruct my faith, but I wouldn't take it back. I'm being much more authentic to who I am now, and I feel really happy with where I am, and I feel much more confident in what I believe now than I ever did as a Christian. I constantly
Mhm.
had questions. I
Mhm.
constantly had things that didn't sit right, didn't feel right. And now I don't. Or
Mhm.
if I do have questions, there's so much freedom to just explore that and
Yeah.
not have to box myself in anywhere, and that's okay.
I think that when I was really in the church and really identified with Christianity, I didn't realize how much of that process of being in the church was was tied to shame. I felt constant shame in the church. And they'll say all day long, don't feel shame. You know, there's a difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And you know, you can say whatever you want.
Yeah.
Christians feel like shit about themselves. Like it's like
yes.
And it's not because they should. It's because we are taught to identify as a sinner. And to walk through life with that posture, it is a posture of, I need to be asking for forgiveness. I need to be saying, sorry, I made a mistake. I am not good enough. It's just this constant kind of thought in your head. And there's a funny, that same friend who I nearly ruined our friendship with by telling her that God doesn't want you to be gay. She used to come, I would invite her to small group with me. And she would
remember that actually.
Yeah. And she would come. And I think more just because she was like, I love Alarie and this is important to her. So I'm going to go. And in my head, I'm thinking, I'm going to convert her to Christianity. And she was just like, I'll throw her a bone and do her small group thing because she just wanted me to feel like,
what a good friend she was.
Such a good friend. Yeah. So she would come, and I remember one night at small group, she spoke up and she was like, you know, I've never met such a nice group of people that think so poorly about themselves. Like, she was just like,
so
you
insightful.
guys just sit in a circle. Yeah, she was like, y'all just sit here and talk about how you're all such terrible people. And she was like, it's really weird because y'all are all really nice, but you all just sit here and are sad about how bad you are and how you need to be praying for
toxic.
each other.
Yes.
And I remember thinking like, and that just kind of like stuck with me of like, from an outsider's perspective, y'all are being real weird. Like y'all are being real like,
that's the natural response, I think. Yeah. You're not supposed to hate yourself. You're not supposed to hate yourself.
Right. Which is so like Christians don't realize that about themselves.
Yeah.
And when you're in the church, you just have and again, it's just this like, if you're being humble,
yes, they take humility to a toxic extreme because they basically they internalize in their minds. They're like, no, I don't hate myself. I love myself through Christ, but I hate the sin. And I'm like, your brain is not processing it that way. From a psychological standpoint, you are teaching your brain that you are not worthy of anything, that you do hate yourself, and that you should feel shameful and guilty all the time because your brain doesn't understand this Christian scope that you have. Your brain is just like, oh, we bad.
Yeah.
I'm bad.
Your brain hears, I need to be forgiven because I messed up. And your brain hears, I messed
constantly.
up. I messed up. I didn't pray enough. I need to be forgiven. Oh, please, God, you're so much better than me. And I'm so down here and terrible. And
for being a totally normal person.
You're speaking death over yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, when you really, I mean, it's interesting when you think about the psychology of it. Like you're speaking, you know, Christians talk about like new life, and the church talks about like we're saved, and you know we have new life and we're fresh start and all this, like you're made new, but you're not really allowed to claim that because it's supposed to be a constant relationship. It's supposed to be a constant, like you're always a sinner. You're always messing up. You're never going to be perfect. And so it's a really weird mind game that you don't realize how stuck in that shame cycle you are until you're out of it and you feel relief.
Yeah. And it totally warps your ability, I think, to like self-reflect in a healthy way. Because from a Christian standpoint, it's like pretty much everything is sin. Anything that is not like a direct worship of God or service to someone else is automatically sin. And that makes it so difficult to have a like neutral intelligent, emotional perspective of when you actually need to reflect on something that maybe you made a mistake. Like if you really did maybe lash out at somebody and you said words you didn't mean, or you acted in a way you're not proud of, a normal, healthy, emotionally intelligent person can say, oh, that didn't feel good the way that I acted, and I feel a little bit guilty, because that's the normal human response. Most humans who are not like evil people or criminals or whatever, most humans have some sense of right or wrong, of good or bad, where they can, on some level, and this is, it's hard for people like narcissists or whatever, but for the general, let's say, healthy emotional people, they have an ability to be like, that didn't feel good. Maybe that was a bad choice. I can take accountability. I can apologize for that. But they also have an idea of like, I don't think this was a bad choice. I think I'm going to stand here and stand up for what I did or whatever. The Christian perspective totally like erases that ability, because everything is bad. And so it's like, whether you were in the right or not, it's like you're constantly self-deprecating. You're constantly like, oh, I'm sorry. The right choice basically is always to self-deprecate and to always basically erase your boundaries and to just forgive, 70 times over, because they believe that's the Jesus way. But I'm like, listen, Jesus also flipped tables. Like he also had boundaries and stood up, but so many, especially women, I think are more apt to do that, to just constantly self-deprecate, because I think we do that a lot naturally. And that is such a slippery place to be. Okay, we are going to wrap up part 1 there. We love to yap, and we went on much longer than we planned. So we're going to do a part 2. So that is it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it, or that it was somehow helpful or insightful for you. It was a really, I think, just great healing conversation for us to have. So I hope it was helpful. Again, don't forget to leave the podcast a 5-star review if you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys in part 2.